The hatchling had been asleep for 11 minutes when he moved. Zira noticed because she had been counting. Not from anxiety, she was past anxiety by now, 3 weeks into the posting, but from habit. She had learned early that the small rhythms of the nest were the only warning system she had. The drakes outside the mountain did not announce themselves. The temperature shifts inside the incubation chamber did not come with alerts. And Val, who was 7 months old and already the size of a draft horse, did not cry when something was wrong. He simply went still in a way that was different from sleep. This was different from sleep. She set down the narrow brush she had been using to clean the calcium deposits from the seam between 2 heating stones, and she crossed the chamber to where he lay curled on the obsidian shelf the king's servants had built for him. His scales were still soft at the edges, the deep amber of unpolished resin, and they caught the light from the vents in the ceiling and scattered it in small warm arcs across the stone walls. His breathing was audible, a low, steady percussion like a bellows worked by patient hands, but his eyes were open. That was the thing. His eyes were open, and he was watching the far corner of the room. Zira followed his gaze. There was nothing there, a seam in the rock, a shadow. She sat down on the floor beside the shelf, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched the nearest curve of his body, and she waited. This was the job, not the official version. The parchment she had signed in the administrative hall of Draveth's court described her role as developmental custodian, 3rd grade, assigned to the care and behavioral monitoring of the crown wormling during the period of the king's political absence. The official version involved charts, growth measurements, dietary records, and a sealed report delivered every 3rd day to the king's steward. But the actual job, the one she had learned by doing, was this: sitting on cold stone in a room that smelled of sulfur and warm copper, waiting for a creature who could not speak, yet to tell her in the only ways available to him what he needed. He made a sound, not a cry. Dragons did not cry, she had learned. The sound was low and buzzing, felt more in the chest than heard in the ear, and it lasted 3 seconds before it stopped. She reached out slowly and placed her hand flat against his nearest foreleg, just above the joint where the scales were still thin enough that she could feel warmth through them. The buzzing came again, longer this time. She had no idea what it meant. She had read the 4 texts available in the court library on draconic early development, and none of them had been written by anyone who had actually spent significant time with a wormling. They were observational documents, written from distance, full of clinical language and significant gaps. The buzzing was not catalogued. Most things she had encountered with Val were not catalogued. She kept her hand where it was and said quietly, "I'm here." He shifted his head toward her. His eyes, amber like his scales, with a vertical pupil that expanded in low light to something approaching round, settled on her face with the focused attention she had come to think of as his thinking expression. He was always watching. Whatever was happening inside that large, soft-scaled head, it involved a great deal of observation. She had started talking to him 3 days in, when the silence of the chamber began to feel less peaceful and more like pressure. She had not expected it to accomplish anything, but she had noticed that he calmed when she spoke, not immediately, but gradually, the way a room cooled after a fire went down. She did not know if it was the specific words, or the sound, or the simple fact of another creature making itself present through language. She had stopped wondering about the reason and simply done it. "There's nothing in the corner," she told him. "I looked, could be a smell from the vent. The thermal exchange sometimes pulls air from the lower tunnels. I noticed it on the 12th day. You were asleep, but I was cleaning the east wall, and there was a mineral smell, something like hot flint. You might be smelling something that isn't a threat." His gaze moved back to the corner. The buzzing did not return. She stayed where she was for another 10 minutes, her hand against his leg, until he lowered his head back to the shelf and his eyes closed. She returned to the heating stones and her brush, but she kept one part of her attention on the shelf the way she kept one part of it always, a background awareness she had developed without deciding to. She was not the kind of person who talked about instinct. She preferred to think of it as accumulated data that had not yet been organized into language. The heating stones were a problem she had been working on for 5 days. The eastern pair were accumulating scale deposits faster than the others, which she suspected was related to the direction of the thermal vents, but she had not been able to confirm it because the king's steward had declined her request for the original construction schematics, saying they were proprietary to the crown. She made a note on her log anyway. Unexplained calcium differential, Eastern Stones, Day 23, recommends schematic review. She knew the recommendation would be ignored. She made it regardless, because accurate records were the only thing that survived the politics of a place like Draveth's court, and she had been a custodian long enough to know that the records always mattered eventually, even when no one was reading them. Val slept, the vents hummed, the chamber held its warmth. Outside, somewhere in the mountain's upper halls, she could hear the distant sound of voices. The court was never entirely quiet, but here in the incubation chamber the sound arrived as a murmur, stripped of its edges, like something heard through water. She thought about the note in the steward's last correspondence. The king's return had been moved forward. Ren, the king, would arrive in 6 days rather than the expected 14. She thought about the way the steward had written the line, clipped, almost as an afterthought, buried beneath 3 paragraphs of administrative requirements. She set the brush down again and looked at Val's sleeping form on the shelf, the slow percussion of his breathing, the small arcs of scattered light. 6 days. She was not sure what she felt about that. She was not sure she wanted to examine it closely yet. She picked up the brush and returned to the stone. The eastern pair would need the deposits cleared before the inspection. Whatever came after, she wanted the work to be right. The king arrived in 4 days, not 6. Sierra was in the middle of recalibrating the humidity intake on the north vent when she heard the change in the mountain. It was not a sound exactly, more a shift in air pressure, a sudden purposefulness in the movement of people in the halls above, the kind of atmospheric change a place makes when something important enters it. She had learned to read buildings the way some people read weather. She finished tightening the calibration screw before she looked toward the chamber door. Val was already awake. He had been sleeping when the change came, but now he sat upright on the shelf, his head raised, his nostrils working in the particular rapid way she had catalogued as scent processing. He did not look at the door. He looked at Sierra. She looked back. "It's all right," she said, which she was not entirely sure was true. The door opened. She had seen paintings of Ren. Every room in the court had at least one, and the artistic convention was consistent. The king rendered in postures of dominance, scales the deep green-black of volcanic glass, wingspans suggested rather than shown, because no painter wanted to attempt the full geometry. The paintings had given her a rough scale that she understood intellectually. Standing in the doorway of the incubation chamber, Ren was larger than the paintings. Not by much, but enough that her body registered it before her mind finished the assessment, a quick pull of attention to the exits, to the distance between herself and the shelf, to the weight and location of the tools in her vest. She did not step back. She made herself not step back. Ren's gaze moved across the chamber with an efficiency that was not quite human and not quite animal, cataloging rather than seeing. It landed on Val. Something in the set of the king's jaw changed, fractional but present. Then it moved to Sierra. "The custodian," he said. His voice was low and resonant, and carried an accent that was not the one she had been taught to expect from the court texts. The accent of the high territories, she thought, old draconic vowel structure preserved in modern speech. "Sierra Vane," she said, "3rd-grade custodian. I've been assigned since the 4th week of the king's absence." "I know what you are," Ren said. "I am looking at what you have done." She waited. His gaze moved slowly around the chamber. The heating stones cleaned. The humidity calibrations adjusted and logged. The shelf, lined with the folded material she had salvaged from an unused storage room after determining that bare obsidian held cold in ways that impeded the hatchling's rest. The log books, stacked in order by date on the secondary shelf she had built from 3 crates, and a board the steward had eventually approved after 2 written requests. He looked at the log books for a long moment. This arrangement, he said, was not in the original custodial brief. No, she agreed. Some of it required requests. Some of it I've noted as provisional, pending review. You moved the heating orientation. I rotated the eastern pair 14 degrees. The calcium deposits were accumulating asymmetrically, which indicated the original angle was creating a thermal gradient. The logs document the differential before and after. Growth rate on the eastern dorsal scales improved in the subsequent week. Wren was still looking at the logs, not at her. The brief said monitoring and recording, he said. The brief said developmental custodian, she replied. She kept her voice level. Development isn't monitoring, it requires intervention. The silence that followed was long enough that she began counting it, a habit she had from long before this posting. Then Val made the buzzing sound. Both of them looked at him. He was sitting fully upright now, watching his father with the thinking expression, the expanded pupils, the fixed attention. He buzzed again, and then he turned his head towards Sierra and buzzed a third time in a slightly different register. She had heard that register twice before. She did not know what it meant in any codified sense. She knew what it had preceded both previous times. She crossed the chamber without looking at Wren and picked up the folded cloth from the secondary shelf, the one she had started leaving near the heating stones in the third week when she noticed the pattern. She spread it on the shelf beside him, and he lowered himself onto it with the particular arrangement of limbs she had taken to thinking of as his settled position, front legs tucked, chin down, eyes still open. She remained standing beside him, one hand resting lightly on the shelf near his head. She could feel Wren watching her. He does that before he needs to rest, but cannot settle on his own, she said. She was not sure why she said it. The sound, it started around day 9. Another silence. I did not know that, Wren said. His voice had changed slightly, not softer, something more difficult to name than that. You were away, she said. I've logged all of it. She felt him looking at the log books again, then at Val, then briefly at her. The steward tells me your requests were often irregular, he said. Yes. He says you exceeded the boundaries of the brief on multiple occasions. Yes. And your response to that characterization? She looked at Val, who had closed his eyes. The buzzing had stopped. His breathing was settling back into the slow percussion she knew as sleep. I would say, she answered carefully, that the brief was written by people who had not spent time in this room. Wren said nothing. She waited. He turned and left the chamber without another word, and she stood in the warm, humming silence until his footsteps in the tunnel outside had faded entirely, and then she sat down on the floor beside the shelf and released the breath she had been holding for, she calculated, approximately 4 minutes. Val's eyes opened briefly, found her face, and closed again. She picked up the brush from where she had left it, near the north vent. The calcium deposits on the eastern stones were building again, small but visible in the right light. She would need to address them before morning. On the 6th day after the king's return, which had been unannounced and was followed by a court that moved at a different frequency, tighter, more alert, like a current that had shifted, the steward came to the incubation chamber with a document and an expression that communicated clearly that he would rather be anywhere else. The document was a custodial termination notice. Sierra read it twice, while the steward stood near the door and studied the heating stones as though they were deeply interesting. There's a 60-day service notice provision in my contract, she said. The Crown has the right to waive the notice period. Yes, she said, I know, I'm asking if they're exercising it. The notice period is waived, the steward said, effective end of the current week. She set the document on the secondary shelf beside the log books. Is there a reason given? The brief has been fulfilled. The king has returned. The role is being restructured. Val was watching the steward from his shelf. He had been watching him since the man entered, with an attention that was different from his usual observation, sharper, less settled. "What does restructuring mean?" she asked. "The custodial function will be absorbed into the general household staff roster, multiple attendants rotating on 6-hour intervals." She did not say what she thought about that. She had learned early in her career that what she thought about administrative decisions was less useful than what she documented. "I'll need a transition period," she said. "Val, the wormling, has specific behavioral patterns that the replacement attendants will need to know. Some of them are not in the general literature. I've logged most of it, but a direct briefing would." "The logs have been noted," the steward said. "The transition period is 3 days." He left. Sarah sat down on the floor, which was something she had never done in front of the steward before, but the termination notice made the social calculus seem less significant. 3 days. She looked at Val. He was still watching the door where the steward had gone. After a moment, he made a sound she had not heard before, not the buzzing, but something lower and less rhythmic, like stones shifting. She wrote it down. Day 31, new vocalization, context, departure of unfamiliar figure, duration approximately 4 seconds, tone lower than previous buzzing, no obvious physiological precursor. Then she looked at the note for a long time. 3 days was not enough time to document what needed to be documented. 3 days was enough to produce a summary that someone might read if they were careful, and that would be ignored if they were not. 3 days was enough to clean the stones one more time and adjust the north vent for the seasonal temperature shift she could see coming in the atmospheric data she had been keeping in a separate notebook that no one had asked to see. 3 days was not enough to teach someone the difference between the settling buzz and the pre-distress buzz, which looked similar if you weren't paying attention and had entirely different implications. 3 days was not enough to establish the kind of accumulated awareness that Val seemed to rely on in the particular way she had come to believe he relied on it. Not consciously, not with language, but in the deep animal way that trust built without either party deciding to build it. She was still sitting on the floor when she heard the footsteps in the tunnel. Not the steward's. The steward moved with a clipped, deliberate rhythm she could identify at 60 meters. These were heavier, slower, the deliberate slowness of something very large choosing not to fill the available space with its movement. Ren entered the chamber alone. He looked at her on the floor. He looked at Val on the shelf. He looked at the termination notice on the secondary shelf beside the log books. "I understand the steward came," he said. "Yes." He acted on standing administrative authority. "I know." Ren moved into the room, not toward the shelf, toward the secondary shelf where he looked at the log books. He had looked at them on the first day too. She had noticed that. "You have 31 days of records," he said. 31 and a half. I update twice daily." He pulled the first book from the stack with a care that surprised her, given the size of the hands doing it, and he opened it to a page near the middle and read in silence for a while. "You noted the calcium differential on day 5, he said. "I noticed it on day 3. It took me 2 days to determine it was consistent rather than incidental." He turned several pages. "You requested the construction schematics." "Twice. The request was denied both times." "Why did you want them?" "To confirm whether the original heating orientation was deliberate or incidental to the chamber design. If deliberate, there might be a structural reason I was overriding. If incidental, I could correct it without concern." He closed the book, set it back on the stack with the same careful attention. "The original orientation was incidental," he said. "The chamber was adapted from a storage room. The heating stones were placed for access, not thermal efficiency." She looked at him. "Then my correction was right." It was. He looked at Val. "He is larger than he should be at this stage. The dorsal scaling is further developed than my advisors projected." She said nothing. "You understand that I am telling you the correction was responsible for that," he said. It was not a question, but it had the structure of one. I logged the correlation. I didn't want to claim causation in the official records without more data. He made a sound. She could not classify it. It was brief, low, and entirely unlike anything she had heard from Val, sharper, more compressed. She realized, with some delay, that it was draconic for something. She did not know what. "The termination notice," Ren said. "Yes. It was issued without my instruction." She held herself very still. The steward said. The steward has standing authority to issue routine administrative terminations. He interpreted the brief's completion as grounds. He was technically correct. A pause, weighted with something she could not read. I would not have made the same decision. The chamber held its usual warmth and hum. Val made the buzzing sound from his shelf. The longer, lower register, the one she had stopped trying to classify and had simply accepted as the sound he made when things were as they should be. Ren looked at his son for a long moment. Something moved in his face that was not quite any expression she had words for. "I would like to understand his sounds," he said quietly. "You have 31 days of observation. I have been away for 11 weeks. She understood, then, what the quality in his voice was. "I can show you," she said. "It will take longer than 3 days." He looked at her. What would it take? Access to the schematics, a revised brief that reflects what the role actually involves, a direct line to you rather than the steward for contested requests. She paused. "And 60 days, at minimum, of transition overlap. Not because I think the role can't be handed off eventually, but because handing it off too fast will cost him." Ren looked at Val. Val's eyes were open, watching his father with the thinking expression, the expanded pupils, the fixed attention. "He looks at me the way he looks at you," Ren said. "Not the same, but the same structure." "He looks at things he's trying to understand," she said. "He does it with the heating stones too, and the north vent. He's watching everything." Yes, a quiet that was different from the previous quiets, something in it that was less defended. He was always going to be observant. It is a wormking trait, but this, he did not finish the sentence. She waited. "This is more developed than I expected," he said, "at this stage." "He had a lot to watch," she said. Then, because she was not certain that was appropriate, "He's been in a room with someone who talks to herself while cleaning calcium deposits. That's probably part of it." The sound again, the brief, compressed, low sound. She was more confident now that it meant something. "Was that," she started. "It is not a word in your language," he said, but he did not sound displeased. She looked at Val, who had lowered his head to the shelf, but kept his eyes open, watching both of them. "I'll write up the schematics request formally," she said. "For the 3rd time, you can approve it at your discretion." "I will approve it today," Ren said. He turned toward the door and then paused, which was not something she would have predicted. "The log books, do you have a copy?" "No." "Make one." He left. She stood in the chamber for a moment, and then she sat back down on the floor because her legs felt less reliable than she preferred, and she wrote in the current log book, "Day 31, continued. King returned to chamber unannounced. Conversation, approximately 19 minutes. Outcome, unconfirmed, but..." She stopped, looked at the door. Wrote, "Outcome pending." Then she closed the book and looked at Val, and he looked back at her with the thinking expression. "He's going to be difficult to work with," she told him. He buzzed. She could not say with certainty what it meant. She suspected she was going to have time to find out. The new brief arrived 2 days later, handwritten on court stationery in a script she had not expected to find readable, and discovered, to her surprise, was perfectly clear. It reorganized the role substantially. Developmental custodian, 1st grade was the new designation. The title sounded better than it felt. The practical changes were more significant than the name. Access to the construction records. A direct reporting line. A revised behavioral observation mandate that included, for the first time in any document she had signed at Draveth's court, language about continuity of care. The steward delivered it in person and said nothing beyond what protocol required. She signed it at the secondary shelf and returned one copy and kept one copy and went back to work. The weeks that followed were different in quality from the weeks before, though on the surface they looked similar. She cleaned the stones. She calibrated the vents. She kept the logs. She talked to Val while he watched her, his eyes following the movement of her hands in the particular attentive way that had not changed since the first week and that she had stopped trying to interpret and simply accepted as the way he moved through the world. What changed was that Ren came to the chamber. Not often, not on a schedule she could predict, but he came, and when he came he stood in the chamber with the contained, effortful stillness of something very large trying not to fill the available space, and he watched Val, and sometimes he watched Sira, and once or twice he asked her things. The asking was not easy for him. She could see that clearly, the brief preparation before each question, the way the words arrived slightly more clipped than his usual speech, like he had trimmed something from them in transit. "The buzz that precedes rest," he said one afternoon, standing near the heating stones while she adjusted the Eastern calibration. "You said it started on day 9. 8, actually. I logged it as 9 because I wasn't certain until the second occurrence." "What preceded it on day 8? She thought back. The north vent had a resonance issue, low-frequency vibration. I fixed it the next morning, but the first night it was audible for about 3 hours. I think he was responding to it. The first buzz happened about an hour in." Ren was quiet. "He was telling you," he said. "I think so. I didn't know it at the time. I just knew something was off." "But you stayed." She looked up from the calibration. "That's the job." He looked at her for a moment. She had become better at reading his silences, not at understanding the specific content of them, but at distinguishing their textures. This one was not dismissive or evaluative. It was something closer to the quality she had heard in his voice in the incubation chamber when he had said, "This is more developed than I expected." "He calls for you," Ren said. "When I am in the chamber and you are not, he makes a sound I do not know." She set down the calibration tool. "What does it sound like?" He made it. She had not expected him to simply make it. She had expected a description. But he made the sound, and it took her a moment to recognize it stripped of the context she was used to, the chamber, the shelf, the particular weight of the mornings when she had heard it most. "That's the one I haven't classified yet," she said. "I know what it precedes. I don't know what it means to him." "In Old Draconic," Ren said, "the root structure of that sound is approximately the one who remains." She did not say anything. "It is not a precise translation," he added. "There is no precise translation." She picked up the calibration tool again, not because there was more to do with it, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "That's in the log," she said finally, "under unclassified vocalizations, cross-referenced by date." "I know, I have read all 37 volumes." She looked at him. "I read quickly," he said, with something that was not quite apologetic and not quite dry. "There's a 41st volume now," she told him. "The shelf isn't big enough. I've been asking the steward for a second shelf for 6 days." He made the brief low sound, clearer now. She had looked it up in the old texts, the ones that were actually useful rather than merely comprehensive, and found a partial entry, an expression of recognition. Not agreement exactly. Something like the moment of understanding that arrives when something was already true and one had simply now noticed. She had been hearing it for 6 weeks and had only just understood what it meant. "I'll have 1 cent," Ren said and left. The shelf arrived the next morning, larger than she had asked for. She filled it within a week. On a morning in the second month after the brief's revision, Sira arrived at the incubation chamber to find Ren already inside. This was unusual. He generally arrived after she was there, when Val was awake and settled, and she had developed, without deciding to, a set of quiet adjustments she made when he was present. She explained things more than she otherwise would. She positioned herself slightly differently relative to Val's shelf. She gave more space to the silences between interactions. Now she stopped in the doorway and looked. Ren was sitting on the floor, not a position she had seen him take before. He was sitting with his back against the eastern wall, his legs extended in front of him, his wings folded with the careful precision of something very large adapting itself to a limited space. Val was asleep on the shelf, and Ren was simply present in the low amber light of the vents, in the warmth and hum of the chamber. He looked up when she entered. She looked at him on the floor and thought of the first day she had sat on the floor of this room, on the fourth morning of the posting, when the silence had felt like pressure, and she had simply folded herself down and talked to Val until the feeling passed. She came into the room and sat down against the western wall, facing him across the chamber, and opened the current log book to the morning entry. Day 91, she wrote, King present on arrival, position, floor, eastern wall, Val, asleep, settled position. She wrote the morning temperature readings. She wrote the humidity calibration status. She wrote her note about the secondary vent coupling, which had been showing minor wear, and which she intended to flag for maintenance before the end of the week. She became aware, after a few minutes, that Ren was watching her write. "What did you do before this?" he asked. She looked up. The question was different from his usual questions, less precise, more open at the edges. "Livestock veterinary assistant," she said. 6 years. Before that, groundskeeper on a provincial estate. Before that, I was 12. He made the recognition sound. "The livestock work was mostly horses," she said. "Some dairy cattle. One very complicated situation involving a breeding pair of Highland elk that I don't fully understand even now." "Do you miss it?" She considered the question honestly. Some of it, the outdoor work, the horses were less complicated than this. Less complicated how? They didn't have fathers who read 41 volumes of behavioral logs. The recognition sound again, and this time it lasted longer and had a quality she had not heard in it before, something looser, less compressed. She looked at Val, still asleep, his breathing the slow, familiar percussion. "He said something yesterday," she said. "I'm still logging it. I don't want to make the wrong interpretation." "Tell me." "I was cleaning the eastern stones and I had my back to him. He made the call, the one you told me the translation for. And then I turned around and he was looking at Ren, at you, sorry. He was looking at the doorway. And then he looked at me. And then he made it again." The chamber held its warmth. "He has started using it," Ren said slowly, "in contexts where I am present, not the doorway, the shelf, when I sit near him." Sierra looked at the logbook, then at Ren, then at Val. "I think," she said carefully, "that he might be using it for both of us." The silence that followed was not the silence of something unresolved. It was the silence of something that had arrived and needed a moment to be real. Ren looked at his son, at the way the amber light moved across the soft-edged scales, at the slow percussion of the sleeping breath. "In the old accounts," he said, "the Wormkings before me, most of them, did not remain with their young during the early period. It was considered unnecessary. The young were capable of surviving under attendant care until the socialization stage." She waited. "My father told me he had visited me twice before my namming ceremony." She kept her voice neutral. "Do you think that was sufficient?" "I thought so," he said, "until I came back and found someone else who knew things about my son that I did not know." A pause, and I understood that the gap was not the custodian's fault. She did not say anything. "The sounds he makes," Ren said, "I am learning them. I wanted you to know that." "I know," she said. "I hear you practicing in the outer hall." He looked at her. The expression was unguarded in a way that his expressions rarely were. "The acoustics in this part of the mountain are unusual," she said. "Everything carries." "I see." "I haven't logged it," she added. "Seemed like the kind of thing that should stay off the record." He looked at her for a moment longer, then he looked at Val. Val had opened his eyes, as he sometimes did in the middle of sleep, not fully awake, but surfacing briefly, blinking at the room. His gaze moved to Ren, then to Sierra, then back to Ren. He made a sound, soft and blurred with sleep, the sound she had been logging for 3 weeks as unclassified. Then he closed his eyes again. Ren said, very quietly, "The one who remains." Sierra wrote it in the log, both instances, the sound, the context, the translation. She looked at what she had written. Outside the chamber, somewhere in the mountain's upper halls, the court was moving through its mourning. Voices and footsteps and the distant sound of something being carried. The ordinary weight of a large place continuing to be itself. Inside the chamber, the vents hummed. The light moved across amber scales. The slow breathing continued its percussion, steady and warm. Sierra closed the logbook and set it on the shelf beside the others. 41 of them now, each one dated in her handwriting, each one a record of a room and what happened in it, and what was built there without any of them deciding to build it, one day at a time, in the warmth and the hum and the light. On the floor of the eastern wall, Ren had not moved. She leaned back against the western wall and let the quiet be what it was.